Appreciate everyone joining us today for Kyber Security's To Cloud or Not to Cloud. I have to wish you May the 4th be with you. Happy May 4th, Star Wars Day. If you're enthusiast, you'll appreciate that. If you're not, just trust me, it's a thing. Today we're going to be talking about options for employing cloud technologies, whether or not they're right for you, and the kinds of decisions you want to go through in trying to make that decision for your organization. I'm Mike Jafrida, President of Kyber Security, joined by Bob Thomas. He's our vCISO, vCIO. He's also a certified information security manager, and one of the folks who helps all of our clients make these kinds of decisions every day. How you doing, Bob?
I'm good, Mike. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So thanks for being had. So sorry, inside joke. All right, so here we go, and I'm going to hand over to you, Bob, to talk about the cloud.
Sounds great. Appreciate it. So, folks, I know this is probably maybe a crazy question for a bunch of folks that are already using it in some respect, but we should probably start out by defining what the cloud is and how it's used, and we're just going to give some, what I would say, common examples. So, cloud computing. Well, I think what everybody should realize is this is not a brand new thing. This is not even a recently new thing. You could probably rewind time 30, 40 years where computer time sharing existed. And this is just the evolution of that. So we've got data centers delivering some sort of servers or services, offering up their resources in order for people to run applications, access data, and not have that equipment on premise within their four walls. The example we've got here up on the screen is use it just like you get electricity from the grid. You're using it, you're paying as you consume it. If you don't use any of it, the bill is insignificant, maybe zero, maybe close to zero. As you add on resources, you will pay more. I think that's a common theme that we're going to talk about throughout the presentation today. I think the most common example that you'll know, we picked Microsoft. You used to have an Exchange server inside your office that hosted your email. Maybe you had, I think a typical thing is I'm coming up on a refresh. I don't really want to buy a new server for Exchange. It's kind of painful to monitor and maintain that. Let me move it to the cloud. And then you chose a place to put it. And Microsoft has probably become, with their Office 365 product, the de facto standard when it comes to email. So you pay a relatively small fee for that mailbox and the storage being offered up at the location in the cloud. All you have to really think about is it's functionally relatively the same as the server that you had in your office, but you don't have that equipment, and most importantly, you don't have the responsibility. Next. So here are some examples of exactly what folks use the cloud for. We just talked about email. I think that's probably the most common, if not websites. Somebody wants a web presence, bang, they go register a domain, quickly put up a site, and what's next right behind that? Well, if I have the domain, I might as well use it to host my mail. Maybe it's in the same place, maybe it's someplace else. Application servers. You have a specific line of business application that runs your world. It's pretty common for that stuff to run in the cloud, whether it's being delivered from one of the big guys, Amazon with AWS and their S3 servers, or Microsoft with their Azure environment. That's how they host servers. Could be Google with Google Share servers. But it even gets down to maybe your application provider is hosting their own thing. I think QuickBooks is probably the most common one that everybody would know of. Intuit has their own hosting facility, and they offer up QuickBooks Online. So those are pretty common. Database, you've got data that you want to be able to store, and maybe storage is growing at such a fast rate that you don't have enough capacity. People will put it off into the cloud and be able to access it from anywhere. And web applications, as time has gone on and as development environments have expanded and changed, not only do you have your data up there, but there's a, from any web browser, you should be able to access it. Very, very common way for people to be able to get to their data, not just from, Windows or Mac, but it could be from a phone or a tablet. Those have become very common as the internet has become ubiquitous. Next. I think this is probably one of the best questions that everybody should be asking. Is my data safe in the cloud? And I'll touch upon these bullet points, but I think there's one thing that is worth mentioning at this point. If you believe that a provider, I'm going to pick on Microsoft, but this is probably, not probably, it is the same for Google. If your mail and any other applications and data are being stored there, Microsoft 365 or part of the Google Workspace, that data is not backed up. I did not stutter. Your data is not being backed up by those providers. They don't have responsibility for doing it. They've gotten press releases to talk about this. They all recommend that you replicate your data to someplace else, what they refer to as a third-party location or third-party data center. So some people will call it cloud-to-cloud backup. The first thing we do when we take on a new client, whether they're on Microsoft or Google for their email and other applications, are we set up cloud-to-cloud backup. We've got to have a safety net in place because all these providers start and stop with providing infrastructure. They're providing the platform for you to run on. They don't have responsibility. If you delete all your mail and you can't recover it, you can't call them and say, can you go back to your backup from 40 days ago and restore that? There is no backup from 40 days ago. That doesn't exist. So that's a baseline thing that everybody should know and understand. So data backup is critical, and not just data backup. How often are they backing up? I just sent one of these comments to a new client of ours to ask their vendor, their line of business vendor, hey, how we get to your application through the internet, via VPN, virtual private network. How often do you guys back that stuff up? And how long do you save it for? What's retention like? And if we have a failure, we can't get to the data because they've had an outage. When should we expect that to be back up and running? How long does it take you to recovery? What are the recovery options? It could be, oh, you can run offline because we replicate a copy back to you. We have a second data center, or we're automatically Microsoft. Let's go back to the 365 thing. Technically, your email should be in 3 places at any given time, not counting on your machine. It's in their primary storage location. It's being replicated, mirrored within that same building to another piece of storage, and then off-site to another piece of storage. So that's what they call data protection. It's not backup because if it, obviously if it gets deleted in one place, before you can blink, it's deleted in the other 2. So that's not really a mechanism for restore, but there are recovery options if there is an out-and-out failure at, let's say, the primary mailbox location or the primary data center. And I think people should all have some level of concern around security. Not just your laptop and not just, wow, maybe I should encrypt my laptop because I carry around some pretty important intellectual property on there. I think it's important to understand, how secure is the data center? When we took on a client and we found out that remote desktop was open to the world at the data center that they were hosting. Nobody knew, nobody understood, from a client's perspective, but we did a security assessment. Look what we turned up. The next thing they wanted to talk about is moving to another data center. And we moved them to Microsoft in that particular instance. But it's real world stuff that you find out when you start to peel back the onion and look at exactly how data centers are constructed and how the stuff works. So security and how you access your data is a thing. Next. So we got a poll here that we've got popped up. You guys can just check off the boxes of what resources you're employing today that are in the cloud already. We've got email, we've got some file storage. File storage could be at Microsoft with a SharePoint OneDrive. It could be Google with Drive. It could be Dropbox or Box or any of these, what they call sync and share applications. Maybe we mentioned QuickBooks Online. Sage has a hosting platform where you can get to Sage 50 or Sage 100 from that. Or if you've got some other, or you're not doing it at all yet, but maybe you're here on today's call, you're thinking about it and want to get some insight on how the decision's made. Give just a minute here in order to get some people to load in their answers.
Brandon, have you gotten a decent chunk to give us some statistics?
Yep, it looks like it's an even split between email, file storage, and applications.
Oh, wow.
All right, very good.
Good.
It's nice to see that some people are already getting involved and using the cloud where appropriate.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk just a minute about why people do this. What are the benefits of migrating to the cloud? And I think probably, that example I gave before where somebody's server is aged out, it's no longer under warranty, it's maybe running old operating system or an old version of an application. And you've come to that fork in the road and you start to think, should I replace it? Do I spend the money on the hardware and the licensing, or should I look at an alternative? And that alternative could be the cloud. So maybe you think about, instead of, plunking down $10,000 for a server and a build and a migration, maybe I pay monthly and I move my information up to some cloud hosted vendor. I think that's probably, in my mind, the top of the list when you start to think about not just why people do it, but when they do it and what they're thinking about. Accessible from anywhere. This has become, obviously, COVID and the eye-opening experience that was, and having people work remotely, work from home, hybrid, everything came to a screeching halt and said, okay, how are people going to be able to work if they're not in the office? And everybody talked about VPN and all sorts of remote access tools. But at the end of the day, if your stuff is stored in the cloud and it's compatible, which is a thing, and I think that's important, that you've got to verify that it's actually going to work from a data center, then you've got access from anywhere. Some people will say anywhere, anytime, any device. If the application is constructed properly, I think that's a fair way to say it. Scalable. This is, I would say, probably the chief reason it takes the concern and the worry out of people's minds when they go to buy something. Am I buying enough? I kind of skinnied it back because it was too much money, but next year will be a better year. I can expand. Well, you can expand within a chassis somewhat, but at some point you'll hit the wall. Up in a data center, certainly you could probably buy as much horsepower, as much storage, as much bandwidth, as much memory as you feel like paying for. Today, this afternoon, we're upgrading memory for a cloud-hosted client that's at Microsoft Azure. They're doubling the amount of memory RAM in one of the servers, their file server that they have up at Microsoft. They said, we're starting to access that more. We're putting more data in the file server, not just in the database. We're massaging the data. We want quicker access. Really, we click a box, unclick another box, hit restart. It'll restart the machine, and you double the amount of memory. It can happen that quickly. This is not waiting for a shipment to arrive, hopeful, and it's not on back order. That scenario, I need more CPUs, I need more RAM, I need more storage. Really, it's a click of the mouse and you can increase. This whole availability during a client site outage is really big. That concept that, my site's down, my people are sitting around doing nothing, that kind of goes away. I mean, we could probably come up with a scenario where it still does apply with an enormous power outage, a storm, internet out, throughout a region. It still applies. But, I had a conversation with a client last week. I said, if this happens, if your site goes down, they were complaining that they're having routine power failures from the location where their office is. They said, you know what, we'll send everybody home. They're used to working from home. We've got everything up at Microsoft on the Azure servers that we built for them, and just send them home and they can work just fine from there. Everybody's got a printer at home. Everybody's got reasonably good internet, assuming we don't have mass outage across a region. That's way. They even went so far as to not sending people home one day when they had an internet outage. They got everybody laptops when they went through a refresh. So I think we got them 9 new laptops for some staff. They fired up their smartphones and linked their smartphones with the tethering app, and they got their internet through their phones, even though the internet in the building was out. So there's ways, as long as you've got access to the internet, that you can get to your information from literally anywhere. And I think the reduced maintenance costs, that's you're laying the responsibility. I think that's what this really comes down to at the data center provider. They are responsible not just for keeping the equipment running, keeping it cool, and making sure it's patched and up to date, but that's part of this whole maintenance cost thing. If they've got, if it is truly being delivered as a service, what we call infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, where they're delivering a running platform for you, they handle all of it. And if they don't handle it, a company like ours would maybe handle patching, maybe tool install for security tools, but it's not something that's on your back that you have to worry about. That's it's pretty key to know. So I touched upon this a little bit a minute ago. What are the downfalls of migrating to the cloud? Okay, there's a widespread internet outage where you don't have an alternative. You don't have a backup line that is still up. You are dependent on that internet connection to be able to get to whatever cloud data center or data centers that you're using. So that is what I would consider a major concern. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Ongoing usage costs. People should be looking at their invoices and trying to understand, if you can, and they're not simple. I hate to say that, but they're fairly complicated because they measure every single piece of usage and bill you for, well, you move data from here to here. Okay, well, that comes at, a penny per megabyte. So added up over the month, though, we spent $16 doing that. Why do we have to pay for that? You're using their system. As simple as that. They get compensated for making the system run and having the horsepower. You have to pay for using it. And that usage cost, it's compute power, it's storage, it's IO, input output, VPN we talked a little bit about, all those pieces, backup, the storage of the backup. So you kind of pay twice, not only for storing it the first time, but storing it as a backup and maybe storing it in multiple locations, could pay triple, just so you have availability if something goes horribly awry. And you really have to weigh, this is, on the front end, migration costs. How much is it going to get for me to get all of my data, all of my applications running inside the data center? What's involved? The servers have to be started up there, built, patched, tools installed to secure them, applications installed. Could be, even the smallest of environments, 3, 4, 5 people. It's going to probably take 2 or 3 servers to be able to replicate a usable, remotely accessible environment. You can't, a lot of the applications don't play friendly over VPN. QuickBooks is the perfect example of that. So you have to have a remote desktop server up there or virtual desktops in order to run it quickly, snappy like you'd expect. So getting the data from place to place, the apps installed, making sure the applications are compatible, that migration, there's your upfront cost. That's really what you should expect. So, if you think about who are the primary people considering a move like this, I think email doesn't apply. Emails are ubiquitous. That's probably for anybody that doesn't want the responsibility or doesn't want to deal with having to host their own and having an internet outage take your mail in. But you start thinking about organization types. Startups are what I would consider a perfect example. They're immediately right at the point where the road's forking and trying to decide, do I spend a lot of money? Do I, hire somebody to build out an entire environment for me that I'm going to put inside my four walls, build a server room, build a server closet, condition the air, get good power in there, and then start buying equipment, racks, etc.? Or do I hit the ground running and put all my stuff? Doesn't have to be with any one vendor. You could spread it around if you're concerned about risk or the compatibility exists better with one data center over another. But I think the startups are, it's almost an easy decision for those folks that certainly don't want to spend their CapEx money on infrastructure. I think this next one, companies with dispersed workforces, this is everybody. Anybody that's thinking about how their business is structured now compared to how it might have been 5 years ago. I talked to somebody yesterday. I said, "Are you expanding?" We had a business review meeting with them. I said, "What's coming next?" He says, "We're hiring people in California." I said, "You're in Boston?" He says, "Yeah, we need some people on the West Coast because of some of the type of testing that they do. We need some folks spread out across the country." And he says, "You know what? They can work from anywhere." We tore down all their servers last year, moved everything up to Microsoft and Amazon. They don't care where the people are. In fact, they have 2 people coming into their office out of 36 every day. That's it. So it makes sense for them to look at cloud as an option. And once you've got people working from anywhere, it's almost mandatory at that point. And rapidly growing organizations, this goes back to what I mentioned, 1 or 2 slides ago, talking about horsepower and the ease at which you can make that type of change. You're paying for usage. You're paying for user-based licensing and consumption. When you have people, we just talked to somebody, they hired 3 people last week. Well, that would have been, I got to get them new computers. They actually had spares around, and they're not so concerned with huge horsepower on the desktop because they're running stuff from a cloud location and it's really running off servers in the data center. They're just getting updates to their screen and clicking mouses and keyboards and updating that data. So a quickly growing organization to be able to get licenses really on demand, get licenses for people in 30 minutes, and we turn them up with whatever resources they need, whether it's email, web application access, VPN. It's all become very easy to grow and grow rapidly, like this slide's talking about. So what organizations need to do from a pros and cons list? I think this is really a great way to determine what makes sense for me. Maybe it's not the perfect scenario if you've already got equipment, you've got relatively new servers, you've got licensing, and most of your folks are in the office. Does it really make sense to move everything to the cloud? I think, then you have to start to think about, do you want the responsibility? Do you have somebody handling it? Is it outsourced, from a support standpoint, maintenance standpoint? But I think, that's kind of a con when it comes to pushing the envelope and pushing yourself to the cloud. That may not be the perfect scenario if everybody's working local to where the servers are today. This comes up a lot. We do a lot of work with manufacturers. If you've got large dependency on specialized equipment, and that equipment tends to either integrate with an application or get its instructions. Manufacturing floor, not like the old days where you're turning knobs and cranking handles. It's not like that anymore. All the data for what the machine has to do is computer controlled. You're downloading a program to it and putting in some piece of stock, metal, plastic, whatever it happens to be, and telling the machine, go, run that program. That's maybe not the easiest thing to connect directly to a cloud environment. That's how the instruction's going to get to the machine. Certainly a little bit more complicated might be a con. And but a pro, organizations with aging infrastructure, I keep talking about this one. What do I do? Do I replace it again? Do I buy new licensing? Do I go a different direction? Do I, some people create a hybrid. Okay, yeah, I could think we do some work for a country club state. And they said, you know what, we're going to move to the cloud version of this application. But that's not really our accounting system. Yeah, that's our membership database. Yeah, it keeps track of, point of sale from a pro shop and cart usage, but not really when it comes to, let's say, financial statements and sending out bills and statements to members. Some of that stuff is still happening in the back office application that they run locally. They actually hybrid. They said, why don't you get us a small server? Let's go modest on site. And we did this, might be 3 years ago now. And so they took their quote unquote line of business application and they pushed that up to the cloud, and they're doing just that. They have two functions. They have that membership database and billing platform for pro shop inventory and rounds and stuff like that. And it processes credit cards through that mechanism. Everything else is done on the local server. So they saw it as an opportunity to move partially to the cloud. And part of that was actually an email move too. They took the email off their server and we migrated to 365, but they still needed everybody to be able to log in, control access, control security, and have their QuickBooks application local. So that's how they decided to do it. And it was the perfect time for them. So ask yourself, what do I do next? How do I make a decision if I haven't made a move so far? And I think the best way to do this, you've got to do some pencil work here on paper, some spreadsheets. You got to figure out what you have. Make an evaluation. Evaluate what your equipment looks like. Is it end of sale? Is it end of life? If it is, maybe it's the point to think about it. Depends what the equipment is. If we're talking about networking equipment and you're still going to have an office, well, you still need to be able to connect, get to the internet, secure yourself with a firewall. So if it's that's not the decision making. You start to get the servers and backup equipment and real big infrastructure and licensing. I think that's where you need to understand what you have and at what point in its life cycle you have it. You got to look at applications. Not every application works in the cloud. If it's not remote desktop capable, if it doesn't run well over VPN, it's really not a great fit. You could probably think of some of these things. The QuickBooks One doesn't run great over VPN, so you have to do it remote desktop. Period. End of story. There's no getting around that. Unless you want to wait a minute and a half every time you click the mouse button. That's how long it takes for it to update. That would never work for you. And I think figure out where your people are. How many locations do you have? Do your people work in the office every day? Are they hybrid? Are they complete remote? I think you have to think about exactly the impact on your staff, what you're going to do. Maybe this is an opportunity. We've been looking to hire, but we haven't been able to find the right people. Maybe you don't care where they are. Maybe, hey, look at that. We got a resume from somebody out in Iowa who sounds perfect, but, we don't have really good remote access into our office. We've had some problems with our servers. Maybe it's not the right fit. Well, maybe it's the right time to move. And I think that's a decision. that may be able to be evaluated and help. You've got to look at your internet. If you have dedicated offices and you've got people in those offices and you're counting on people being able to function from there, the internet's got to be reliable. It can't be hit or miss. And quite honestly, every single client that we've got that's in a hosting environment, we've had the discussion with every one of them. Backup line, failover line, what if? I was at a car dealer yesterday. That car dealer has 2 firewalls. They don't have anything there inside their building server-wise, but they've got 2 firewalls because if their internet's down, they can't service cars. They can't get to the manufacturer's website. They can't get to their dealer management system. They can't finance new cars. That's a big problem. You can't function. So they not only have 2 firewalls, they've got 2 pieces of internet. They've got a fiber line and a cable modem line. One of those goes down, it automatically flips over. That's the type of thing I think it's just about mandatory once you get to nothing is inside my 4 walls. I'm counting on being able to get to my applications, and the internet is the conduit to do that. And then I think you got to do, you got to put pencil to paper and figure out from an investment standpoint, if I buy, lease, rent, whatever it would be, equipment inside my 4 walls, and what's that going to cost up front? What's it going to cost to maintain, keep it up to date, patch it? I think there's, it needs care and feeding. And, what happens after 3 years, 4 years, 5 years? Am I going to have to do that whole thing again? Am I going to get that distance out of it? What happens when my application vendor changes and they say, oh, well, you need this operating system 2022, let's say, instead of 16. Oh, we got to wipe the machine and reload. That's cost. Not to say that doesn't exist in the cloud, because that same scenario could be in the cloud. It just might happen faster because of the resources there. But you've got to compare what that CapEx side is against OpEx if you're going to pay monthly for whatever is necessary to allow you compute power, give you the access to the application, the storage, the backup. Make sure you cover all the pieces. Not, compute's easy to find. You go on a calculator, one of these pricing calculators, and say, how much is it for a server? That's just a start. And you got to consider backup. You got to consider storage of the backup. How much information is moving in and out of the system, because you get charged for that as well. So there's a lot of pieces to think about. It's best to be able to, this goes with the pros and cons. You've got to be able to put them side by side. What's it going to cost for me to put it inside my business, my office? What's it going to cost in the data center for me to pay monthly? I think that's the way to think about this.
And just to add into that, Bob, I think when you're doing that CapEx, OpEx comparison, what else could I put that capital towards to further my business? If I were not to spend as much up front and say, okay, I'm spreading that out over time, and essentially leasing the space or the licenses and all that in the cloud.
That's a really good point.
The opportunity cost plays a part in your decision.
Yeah, cost of money, what you're going to do with that, what the opportunity is. Think about, go back to economics, opportunity cost, what I could have done.
Right. So that's our prepared content. Thank you, Bob, for putting that together.
Sure.
The floor is open for questions. I have a handful here, but continue to submit them in the Q&A or in the chat to us. I've seen a few versions of this question, Bob, so I'm going to try to summarize it. How do I figure out if my line of business application supports the cloud, is okay to go to the cloud? You said a couple of times some do, some don't. How do I figure that out?
Yeah, I think so. One of the ways we start with that specific question, when we have the conversation with the client, is we go directly to the manufacturer and try to get every manufacturer of of an application should have a system requirements document. Some do, some don't. Some are very thin on what they show, and some have booklets that will tell you about this. But I think it has to be, I think, a very detailed conversation with the manufacturer of the application developer to determine what environment, was this application developed in? Is it cloud friendly or remote friendly? I'm trying to think of an example. We have an example. Yes. We've got a client up in South Windsor, Connecticut, and they're running the quote unquote legacy version of an application. Won't work in the cloud. Will work over VPN, but only with remote desktop or some sort of remote access. And they've been talked to by the manufacturers, say, if you went to our new Extreme platform, you could put that application anywhere. They would host it. They would give you the license. You could, quote unquote, bring your own license, bring your own cloud and put it someplace, or it could be run locally. But the remote access is much faster, no longer needs remote desktop to be able to run remotely. Put the software on your laptop, run around, connect to VPN, and be able to run it from anywhere to get to the data. So that's an example of, yes, we talked to the vendor, kind of a powwow with them and our client, and said, okay, what are the options? We're looking at going to a new server. Which way should we go? What are the cost implications of doing that from a licensing standpoint? Obviously, new licenses probably going to cost something to move up to the newest version. So I think that's you got to get with the software vendor.
Gotcha.
I mean, you can do all sorts of testing on your own, but I think it would be premature to do that without having a conversation with the vendor. It might be even rambunctious to be able to just go out and do it.
So we have a few here around security. One of them, how do you evaluate the security of a cloud-based system?
Yeah, so if you don't already have resources there, there's plenty of analysis that has already been done comparing data centers. But I think you have to measure, how do you access it? Do they have certifications around, let's say, SOC 2 as an example, SOC 2. So that particular level means that not only have they passed certain security requirements, but there's documentation, testing in place that they follow on a day in and day out basis. You can get these reports, if you go back to Microsoft has these publicly available, and they will actually even tell you the levels of security, physical security, of how each of the data centers where their equipment is located, how they're being protected, armed guards, fingerprint, biometric, all the criteria for being able to even get through the front door. That doesn't even get you close to the servers. You're not getting in a real data center unless you have been quote unquote pre-approved. And that doesn't mean while you're standing there. Somebody would have had to say that you're going there, provided ID, provide matching ID while you're there. And you get into fingerprinting and being able to, maybe it goes to retinal scan. There's a lot of these pieces, but I think I have to go back to the example that we had, where we were talking to this client who just asked us to do a security assessment. They were not a full-fledged managed client yet. And they said, well, all of our stuff since COVID, we moved to a place up the road. We want that to be part of the evaluation. And we did. And it wasn't until then that they found out not only that I'm not sure there was much good, it was bad and it was ugly. And, it was enough to make them move almost instantly. Not just from an access standpoint, how they were accessing, but how wide open the access was. There was no proof of backups being completed from a log perspective. Some of this stuff, unfortunately, unless you ask a million questions on the front end, the questions to ask, it gets a little dicey and may have to, roll the dice or just take the biggest guy out there, never get fired for choosing IBM's sort of decision, where you go to Microsoft, you go to Amazon with AWS or Google. But I'm going to tell you one thing. In those environments, there are certain rules, there are certain ways that they do things. If you said, well, I need this piece of equipment put into the data center, that's not an option in those locations. They're not taking equipment of yours and putting it in there, no matter how good or how proprietary it might be and that you need it. You're going to run on their infrastructure, or you're not going to put your stuff there. It's just how they operate, because they want complete control. If you need flexibility, there's data centers that do that. You will have never heard of their name, I guarantee it, but that doesn't make them bad. Some of them are quite large. One of them that a friend of mine uses, there's 7 locations in the United States spread around. They try to be as close to the end user population as possible and try to spread their risk. But it depends on what you're asking of the data center, number one. And number two, I think you've got to do some due diligence and do some digging.
Yeah, so it sounds like you got to consider the physical as well as cybersecurity concerns, and
Yes.
that any reputable data center ought to be able to provide you that documentation for what they're doing.
But absolutely, if they're hiding that, they're hiding something.
Yeah. And if you're talking about a specific software application and utilizing something that is a cloud-based software application, I'm going to throw out Salesforce as an example. They
Sure.
too should be able to provide you the security measures that they have in place to protect your data and databases that are online. It's their responsibility for that security and for the pieces that are in their purview. And
Yeah.
therefore, it's their responsibility to provide you documentation about what they're doing to secure them.
I agree. And I have to reiterate, you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes that flows through to, I don't know what to ask. And, that's why I sent that list of 11 questions to one of our clients to ask of their hosting vendor yesterday. I said, look, I agree they're the biggest player in your market from a line of business standpoint. And I'm sure they're fine. But if you don't ask, you don't know. And if you don't, sometimes asking a few different ways, maybe even the same question, it's very easy to say, do you back up our data? Sure. Well, sure doesn't tell me how often. Sure doesn't tell me how often you test it and validate that it's actually working. And that was another thing that came up, during that security assessment we did. Yeah, show us the logs. Well, they didn't want to, because the logs told them that their stuff wasn't working. So
Yeah.
I think that's critical.
So do your homework.
Yeah, it's going to take some to be able to get there. Yep.
Yeah, a follow-up on that security question, and you mentioned this a little bit, is, I get these security questionnaires from my bank or my vendors or other folks that I do business with. How will it affect the way I'm able to answer those questions on the questionnaires if I decide to migrate something to the cloud?
Well, some of this comes down to application level, what the application will support. I'll use the easiest one of all that every questionnaire that clients send to us to help them with is multi-factor authentication available and enabled. And what they're really asking is it enabled everywhere for every user? That's what they really want to hear. Answers that don't include everywhere and everyone get insurance carriers concerned that there's still a gap, there's still a hole for somebody to get through. So I think it can help, but by default, it doesn't mean that all the security functionality and features are turned on. You could use Microsoft as an example. Until very recently, and it's still got a little hole in it, multi-factor was an option. It wasn't a pay option, but it was not automatically on by default for email. So, everybody said this. They make it really easy to put your email up there and get it working. 100%. Logging was not turned on by default. So if something happened and you got breached, you wouldn't really be able to figure out exactly how the people got in and be able to trail it back with any forensics. So I think I think the short answer is, if you've got lax controls in place on local servers and have not done maintenance and not kept up to date, and you're thinking a migration will help, I think it will help. But I don't think you can automatically assume that, oh, I just pay this monthly and everything's taken care of. That doesn't mean that the servers are all equipped with the best endpoint protection, that logs are being collected. If they're being collected, are they being collected for at least 90 days, which is most of the compliance out there needs at least 90 days of storage. Who's looking at the logs? Who's monitoring traffic and making sure that somebody's not breached the network up there and been able to, basically sit idle waiting and watching, looking for an opportunity. So I think it can help, but I still think there's questions to be asked around.
Fair enough. Some of the other questions I have here are somewhat specific, which means people are thinking about their environments. And so I'm going to move on to our next slide here. We are offering a cloud evaluation worksheet that you can go through yourself to try to understand better whether or not the cloud is appropriate for you. There's a link that just went into the chat where you can click and download this worksheet. Take a look at it. If you have questions with it when you go through it, please feel free to reach out. We're happy to go through and help you understand the different variables that are in there. The worksheet, is somewhat generic because it's for a wide audience. So if you don't see something specific in there that you're concerned about, again, please feel free to reach out. There's an email address on there that you can reach out to, and someone will be able to get back to you and get you some answers to those questions. So we encourage you to do that if you are considering cloud efforts. Hopefully this will help you figure out what the right next step is for you.
Yeah, we didn't talk about this at all, Mike, but with certain compliances, depending on, I'll use Department of Defense because we do a lot of work in that space as well. If you're part of the defense industrial base, there's some specific regulations around where you can put your data and your application. The government wants to know that no foreign employees, you've got to be a U.S. citizen in order to work, support, and be able to have access inside these data centers. So there are specific data centers and specific locations in data centers that are government only and government regulated. There may be something there depending on the industry that you're in. Obviously, if you're in the medical field, HIPAA takes precedence on securing PHI and EPHI information, and there's certain security requirements there. So, Mike's 100% right. We built that worksheet to be fairly universal, but there will be situations in each industry that may have some special requirements, special data needs.
Yeah, for sure. When you get into a compliance standard, you really have to make sure you're reading the questions the right way and not assuming you have the right answer, or else you could be found liable of fraud for indicating that you had something in place that you don't. So
yeah, I think that
compliance, you ask a lot of questions.
That's a really good point there. To wrap a bow on that, those security questionnaires, a lot of times they're coming from cyber liability insurance applications or carriers. And, if you don't answer those truthfully and you have a breach or a loss, they will figure it out that what was on paper was not really in place from a control standpoint, and the claims will be denied. We've already seen it. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I didn't know is not a good defense in that case. So,
No,
make sure
No,
you're
well,
crossing your
that's for
T's and
sure.
dotting your I's.
yeah. You really have to be very, very careful about reading those questions and answering them truthfully, that you can stand behind it and say, yes, my data is encrypted on my backups. Okay, show me. That's what they're going to want to see.
Regardless of whether that's local or in the cloud. So.
Mhm. Yes.
I want to thank everybody for spending the last 51 minutes with us. Thank you to our friends at ImageWorks who help us put all these webinars on. If you've gotten signed up for this, you'll probably hear about future webinars we have going on, and we hope to see everybody again. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Brandon, and thank you everyone online.
Thanks, folks.
And may the 4th be with you.
Well played.